some day in the future. Now we move to the late Roman period with Kyriakos Fragkoulis from the Center for Byzantine, Ottoman and Modern Greek Studies from the University of Birmingham. He is currently working on late Roman ceramic from Dion in Macedonia. He highlights in his communication Black Sea amphorae from the excavation of the late antique Dion in Macedonia. Please.
Thank you for your introduction. Just give me a second to share screen.
Just to close my PowerPoint, I think. Good.
Can you see the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. In recent years, scholarly knowledge on the production and circulation of Pontic amphorae during the Roman Imperial and Late Antique periods has substantially increased. Notably, as regards the presence of Black Sea wares in the Mediterranean, we may safely declare that it was greater than in the past. Nevertheless, despite all this progress, the Aegean Sea region continues to occupy a minor place in the pertinent scholarship, while northern Greek sites like Dion, the focal point of our presentation, are under attention. Albeit, taking into consideration the immediate proximity of the two geographical areas and the fact that in earlier times the distributional epicenter of trade amphorae from Pontus lay in the Aegean, the above situation seems rather unjustifiable. Dion, one of the most historic sites in Macedonia, is situated at a strategic location in the northeastern foothills of Mount Olympus, relatively close to the sea. After having served as the sacred city of the Macedonian and Hellenistic periods, Dion became the site of a Roman colony. During late antiquity, it remained the major urban settlement in the region of Pieria and became the seat of a bishopric. Several decades of systematic excavations at Dion have brought to light a relatively small but representative part of the ancient city, along with a multitude of movable finds, including large quantities of pottery that remain almost entirely unpublished. The present paper is concerned with the amphoric material of a likely or established Black Sea origin, studied in the context of my ongoing doctoral research on the late antique pottery of Dion. As for the occurring types, it is made up almost exclusively of Zeest 80 amphorae, apart from few sherds related to the Sinopean amphora series. These ceramics derive from archaeological contexts of the second half of the 3rd and the late 5th, early 6th century, yielded respectively at the so-called House of Heliodorus, a building with a probable commercial use in its latest phase, and the cemetery basilica of the city. The significance of the sample under investigation lies mainly in the fact that those amphora types are thought to appear only rarely at Greek sites. Furthermore, the Zeest 80 appears at Dion in both the above time periods and also in considerable numbers, reaching in certain 3rd century contexts over 30% of the overall amphora finds in terms of vessel estimates. Zeest 80, or MRA5, is a sizable transport vessel with a characteristic shape that remained largely unchanged throughout its long production life. Its major morphological features are the wide mouth, the heavy rim, the long truncated neck, the massive grooved handles, and the ovoid to subspherical body ribbed on the shoulder and close to the base, ending in a short, solid spike. This amphora has a remarkably wide chronological span, believed to range from the late 1st to the 6th century AD, if not later. The different variants produced during that long period have been generally classified into two main subtypes, an early and a late one, with a turning point between the two having been placed at around the mid-4th century. Dion is one of the very few sites that have yielded examples from both the early and the late phase of Zeest 80's development, actually providing, as far as we know, the first examples of the late variant outside the Black Sea region. Nevertheless, the majority of finds belongs to the early variants, which is also in accordance with the peak of the export production of the Zeest 80 in the 3rd century. The two subtypes are distinguished from each other mostly in terms of rim profile and size. Starting from the latter point, there seems to have been a general trend of constant decrease in capacity, a tendency that is reflected on the Dion record too. However, what also emerges from it is a combined presence of Zeest 80 amphorae of various sizes and capacities, with all that implies regarding the possibility of these vessels originating from multiple centers and or carrying a variety of products. One of the most characteristic attributes of the early subtype is the massive and distinctly wide, flat-topped, outward sloping rim, marked off on the outside by two sharp and deep grooves. Among the Dion sample, two different rim versions are noticeable. In the first, the edge bevels outwards very gently, with the top surface being almost horizontal. In the second version, the outward slope is much steeper, forming a wedge-shaped rim. Moreover, rim variant A is combined with a long cylindrical tapering neck, whereas variant B usually crowns one that has a squat conical form. The coexistence of both rim forms in the same context is seemingly proof that they were manufactured more or less contemporaneously. On the other hand, the sample is unfortunately devoid of rim sheds of the late subtype and is hence unable to contribute anything of substance regarding this key attribute of Zeest 80's late typological development, which has now become thinner and much less prominent. All the same, it provides meaningful evidence about the form of the rest of the vessel. For example, the heavy grooved handles have remained virtually unchanged in shape and size since the late 3rd century, whereas the bottom of the vessel ends in a rounded, ribbed, knob-like toe that is shorter and less massive than the conical, spiky one of the early subtype. Now, it's time to turn our attention to the issue of the origin of the Zeest 80 amphora, which has been the subject of considerable debates and still remains undetermined. Several different regions, apart from the Pontic littoral, have been suggested, including the North Aegean. The wide circulation of the type in a Macedonian city like Dion could be seen as an implication of reproduction in the particular area, a possibility that cannot be excluded, though we still consider the Black Sea as the most likely source for that amphora. The key underpinning element in this scenario is the high frequency of finds along the northern and western coast of Pontus, and more importantly, the distribution of the late variants almost exclusively to the Pontic region. Even though the Dion record provides tangible proof that the Zeest 80 continued reaching the Aegean during the late phase of its production, the fact remains that, regardless of their chronology, the majority of examples of this amphora type recovered to date have come from sites around the Black Sea. Apparently, this is a clear sign that the production source lay close to those locations. An additional argument in favor of the suggestion concerned is the coexistence at Dion of Zeest 80 amphorae with transport vessels of an established Pontic origin, namely the Sinopean amphorae. An aspect directly related to the issue of provenance of the Zeest 80 is that of fabric appearance and composition. According to the Dion evidence, all relevant finds, irrespective of whether they belong to the early or the late subtype, have been made of the same hard brownish red fabric. Although different centers of production might have existed, these were located in the same wider region throughout time. After having examined the core material of this presentation, let us now have a look at the small, rather enigmatic group of sherds from the cemetery Basilica of Dion that belong to the amphora series of Sinope, a major exporter and amphora production center of the Black Sea from the Hellenistic to the late Antique periods. On the basis of the few diagnostic sherds at our disposal, these fragments, which seem to correspond to two vessels, have been attributed to type 1 of fabric group B in the Sinopean typology. The general features of this type, namely the egg-shaped body, the massive looped handles oval in section, and the pointed base, common in all three amphora shapes comprising group B, continue the local tradition in the morphological evolution of amphorae. In addition, type 1 is characterized by a cylindrical neck, a beamed rim, and a short and wide conical toe. However, although their fabric looks Sinopean, in terms of form, we find it's rather possible that the basilica finds actually belong to a copy of the B Sinopean 1 type, since it is acknowledged that imitations of this amphora were manufactured by several other centers, probably situated in southern Pontus as well. Nonetheless, the most problematic issue here is dating. Type B Sinopean 1 is widely regarded as an amphora of the late 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. But the relevant part of the record from the basilica excavations at Dion is missing important data, and consequently, the chronology of the ceramic material concerned remains unclear. Still, apart from the typology, there's no further reason to assume an origin from a level that predates the foundation of the basilica, which is placed around the mid-5th century at the earliest. Indicatively, their appearance is not reminiscent of residual pottery, whereas their co-finds mostly comprise pieces of Zeest amphorae belonging to the late variants of the type. On top of that, according to some reports from the Black Sea and Lower Danube areas, Group B Sinopean amphora have indeed been recovered from 5th century contexts. Taking into consideration that various details regarding the typological development and chronology of the Sinopean amphora remain unknown, we are of the view that the production of the B Sinopean 1 time might have persisted well into the early Byzantine period, a possibility that should not be automatically rejected but further investigated. At this point, it is relevant to mention the discovery elsewhere in the city of Dion, and specifically into a large amphora deposit of the 3rd century, of several well-preserved vessels that this time can be attributed with enough certainty to an assumed imitation of the B Sinopean 1 amphora, namely type Zeest 68. Still, this pottery has not been included in our study material, and thus we cannot go into much detail about it. In any case, the above vessels, together with the basilica fragments, contribute substantially to the wider knowledge on the distribution of the particular amphora of Sinope, which is considered to be quite limited outside the Black Sea, while the Dion finds are, as far as we know, the first to be reported from the North Aegean region. In conclusion, the rather unexpected finds discussed so far demonstrate the existence of substantial and continuous trade connections of the city of Dion with the Black Sea, extending from the Roman imperial times to the latter part of late antiquity. This makes us think that the apparent scarcity of finds from Greek territories is mainly due to the lack of specialized research and publication. Apart from Dion, few other discoveries from neighboring sites, with the most characteristic being the example of Demetrias in Thessaly, constitute direct indications that in late antiquity, trade amphorae from Pontus Euxenus reached the Aegean region and northern Greece more often than commonly believed. We are certain that further investigation and new finds from Dion and beyond will consolidate this thesis. Thank you very much for your attention.